Inside a room that looked more like an abandoned dump, full of flies, with doors and windows shut, and reeking of a foul stench, a young man was sitting at his computer. It seemed like he was playing some kind of game like Minecraft. Young Sung Guy was 18 years old and had been in that putrid state for 3 months because he felt betrayed by everyone around him. Someone was knocking on the door, furious, yelling that he was just making excuses to stay isolated playing games. A man was shouting at him from outside, asking when he was going to come out of that room. But he was one of the reasons Yeom Sung Guy didn't want to come out. The man asks the woman to grab a hammer, but she asks Yeom Sung Gi's father to be more patient with the boy. After all, she had moved into the house right after his mother had left. He comforts the woman, who seemed more worried about her own future with the old man than with the boy in the room, pretending to be emotional as she hugs him. Soon the old man suggests they go out for dinner to give his son a bit more time. He asks what she would like, and as opportunistic as she was, the woman makes her move. Meanwhile, Yeom Sung Gi could hear the entire conversation between those two idiots from his room. His phone vibrates on the table, and a message pops up. Someone named Kim Sung Hwan writes saying that Yeom Sung Gi's suspension had been lifted, and that he could now return to school to get beaten up. Well, he was one of the reasons the kid ended up like that. 3 months earlier in a Korean school, a guy raises his fist and lands a blow squarely on someone, sending him flying. The rest of the gang watches and mocks the boy who was getting beaten, but one of them seemed to feel guilty. The boy who had been hit was Yeom Sung Ji, and the gang leader tells him to get up so he can hit him again. Yeom Sung Gi crawls closer and begs Sung Hwan, the very boy who looked uncomfortable, for mercy because they had been friends since elementary school. He looks at his old friend lying on the ground and remembers the past. But he's quickly snapped back when the gang leader asks if he was really friends with a loser like that. So that's why he couldn't hit the kid and acted like a coward, they remark. To protect his reputation, instead of saving a friend, Sung Hwan decides to kick him. He keeps up the act, saying they were never friends. Where had he gotten that stupid idea? Sung Hwan keeps hitting him non-stop. The other two keep fueling the humiliation. Even all bruised and swollen, Yeom Sung Guy speaks again and tells him to never dare call him a friend again. He didn't want to be a loser like Yeom Sung Guy. Back to the present moment, he was still immersed in his game. It really did make sense that he wanted to stay in that continuous isolation. On his screen, the game asks whether he wants to save the Hellcraft map. He clicks yes and decides to upload that new map to the game. While it was uploading, he took the chance to review some of the map's features. At least in that world reflected on his monitor, he wasn't betrayed. The young man posted the link to the new map on the game's blog, and soon after, several users sent messages thanking him for that new creation. Lying in bed, Yeom Sung Gi tried to convince himself that that was all he needed. But even though he wanted to believe that staying in his room and creating maps was enough, it wasn't true. In truth, he felt lonely and afraid that if he went out, he'd be betrayed again. After some time asleep, he got up again. Most likely, his father and that woman were already asleep. He went back to the computer to check the reviews on the map he had created. There, more praise followed. Users loved how difficult and well-crafted his maps were. He was happy to know that people liked his work. Suddenly, a new message notification appeared in the corner of his computer screen. That message was a bit puzzling, as it was written like this: "Hello human, I had fun with the game. It really goes toe-to-toe with real hell. Could I speak to you in person to discuss the creation of hell?" Yeom Sung Gi felt like a child was inviting him to a job interview. Besides, how would they talk in person without arranging a location? A deep voice echoed from a shadowy place, saying that finding a human's location would be nothing to him. A snap of fingers followed those words. Suddenly, a fiery portal began to open inside the teenager's bedroom. He looked at that light in shock, thinking his room was on fire. But out of nowhere, a figure started to form amidst the flames, scaring Yeom Sung Guy even more. The demon's deep voice reverberated through the room as he introduced himself. He said he was the master of the 20th hell that was about to be created, and his name was Baphomet. The protagonist let out a sigh. Surely depression and months of isolation had finally driven him insane. He was hallucinating ghosts now. Footsteps were heard as Baphomet approached and lifted him by the arm, saying he was no mere ghost or hallucination. He had come for him to make use of the boy's talent. Yeom Sung-gae was in shock. It was actually real. He broke free from the demon's grip and tried to back away, but Baphomet told him to calm down, because if he didn't, he'd rip out his brain and eat it to absorb his knowledge. Now sitting as if they were in a job interview, the two stared at each other while the boy opened a can of soda. So he was a real demon, the boy asked. And Baphomet said he wasn't just real, he was one of the upper demons, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He drank from the soda can, and Yeom Sung-gae asked if he had seen the Hellcraft map he had created. Baphomet said yes, and added that he was impressed by his skills. That map wasn't particularly impressive, yet despite being inescapable, he had made it look like there was still light at the end of the tunnel, a false hope, cleverly designed as traps to torment players. Despite the cruelty, it maintained a certain dignity in its design. Yeom Sung-gae looked at him, thinking he had created the map inspired by his overwhelming resentment. The demon said that hell was starting to run out of space and needed to be expanded quickly, and Baphomet had been chosen to be the master of this new hell. Therefore, he wanted Yeom Sung-gae to be the creator. He wanted this new place to resemble Hellcraft, or perhaps be even worse. The boy thought deeply about it, but he had no intention of getting involved with the demon. He just wanted to keep living the way he was now. Amid all that garbage, how could he be satisfied with such a miserable life? Baphomet questioned. He still had one more offer to make. With the projection of a new hell, they'd need to run some tests before the official opening. That bit of information made the boy a bit more interested. So the final proposal was that if he created that hell, he would have free will to imprison any sinner he wanted in it, those who had betrayed him. Wouldn't he like to send them to a hell of his own creation? It seemed like Yeom Sung-gae had made his decision. Due to his weakness and hatred toward those who had wronged him, he decided he would be the new creator and took the key that was offered to him. If accepting to create a hell meant he could take revenge on those worms, he would do anything. Without a second's hesitation, he grabbed the key as if he had been waiting for that moment all along. Baphomet clasped his hands together, and from that moment on, their contract was sealed. Baphomet asked what kind of hell he would like to create, because to create a hell, 2 essential elements were necessary. The boy asked what those things were. The first was that hell needed to have a crime as its theme, such as the hell of greed, the hell of lies, among others. So he'd have to think of another sin or crime to use. Since greed and lies already existed, he would have to come up with a main theme that involved the people he wanted to punish. And the second rule was that hell had to have an architecture that was inescapable. The purpose of hell was to torture its sinners forever. So if souls managed to escape, that hell would disappear and its owner would face death. In other words, if there was any flaw in the hell created by Yeom Sung-gae, Baphomet would be held responsible. But he had nothing to worry about, the demon replied. If a flaw did appear and he ended up dying, he'd make sure to destroy the young man's soul first. Yeom Sung-gae swallowed hard for a moment. Well, it was time to begin. Baphomet snapped his fingers, and everything around them began to change. The clouds turned red, storm lightning filled the city's sky. One of the bolts struck the young man's house and affected his computer. Gradually, the game on his screen began to change its design. As he used the game to program the new location, the demon's subordinates would be building it in real time. It seemed like everything in Yeom Sung-gae's computer was completely connected to hell. It was time for that human to show what he was capable of. A construction sign was placed, and Baphomet calmly watched it all unfold. He seemed to have really liked that soda. He was drinking one after another. His subordinates looked ready to begin construction. They were just waiting for Yeom Sung-gae's command. An arrow appeared, and the foreman gave the signal to the small minions. They all moved to an area where they started building block by block. Meanwhile, Baphomet observed the human in his room. Since they had made the contract in the human world 7 days, 4 hours and 37 minutes had passed. That human, without even sleeping properly, was creating a magnificent castle at first glance. Was that human special, or was it his hatred that made him special? The demon wondered. He had definitely made a good choice. From Baphomet's screen, he heard Yeom Sung Gae say the project was done. He clapped and congratulated him. The human had created the hell he wanted, faster than expected. Now all that was left was to choose a name. And Yeom Sung Gae replied, saying betrayal. That would be the hell for traitors. On the computer screen, the same question appeared again, one he was already used to. He clicked yes, and the new map, Hell of the Traitors, was saved. He stood up and after so many months, left his room and saw his stepmother in the kitchen. It was time for revenge. Baphomet reminded him that he could only send to the hell he created those who had committed the sin of betrayal. That was one of the conditions for it to work. He had understood. If the conditions weren't met, it wouldn't function. But if the key reacted, it would open the gates of hell and drag all the sinners inside. The young man approached his stepmother, who was distracted taking pictures of her new purse. Well, look who crawled out of his hole. You should take a shower, she said. You stink just like your mother, she added. Yeom Sung Gae looked at the key in his hand. It was a complicated choice. Since hell had been created so recently, there was no way a sin could have been committed in that time frame. He would probably have to wait a few days, but his stepmother kept being vile, asking why he had to come out of the room while she was around. Meanwhile, she was picking which purse photo to post. The more she complained, the more he wanted to send her to his hell right away, because she was definitely scum who deserved to suffer. At 23, his mother had been sold into an arranged marriage between families. Because of that, the poor woman had suffered at the hands of her husband's relatives her entire life. Even so, she always smiled at Yeom Sung Gae whenever he was nearby. Everything had gone wrong. She was probably the one who should have cried the most, yet she kept that smile on her face. Yeom Sung Gae couldn't stand hearing the fights and seeing his mother show up hurt afterward, acting like nothing had happened. But eventually she lost her place at the table. If it had at least been for love, it would have been less infuriating. Being replaced by a younger woman clearly only interested in money. The worst part was that Yeom Sung Gae would hear her bad-mouthing his father to her friends, and the Viper never bothered to hide it, even threatening him. If he didn't want to be kicked out like his mother, he'd better stay quiet. She was nothing but a parasite who wanted to spoil herself at others' expense, even if it meant destroying a family. Yeom Sung Gae remained there, while she grew more and more irritated. So he built up the courage to ask how much she'd be willing to take to leave his father. The woman looked at him confused by the sudden question. He said she didn't have to pretend in front of him. It was obvious she was only with his dad for the money. The stepmother felt insulted by that. Who did that brat think he was? But then he made an unexpected offer. The 100 million one his father had saved for college, and he knew exactly where his father kept the investment notebook. Altogether, it would amount to around $1 billion. Her eyes lit up with greed as she heard that. If she didn't believe him, he could show her. Still doubtful, the stepmother stood up to follow him and watched as he opened the safe. Up until then, she had only thought about getting a few luxury items she wanted, maybe even a property in her name. But if what Yeom Sung Gae was saying was true, she was set for life. He finished opening the safe, and there they were, gold bars, investment books, and a good amount of cash. To convince her, he took a portion and said that with that money, she could go live her life abroad if she wanted. But something didn't sit right with her. Why was he doing this out of nowhere? Baphomet appeared, amused by the scene. It seemed even a woman like her still had some intuition left. What should they do now to make her accept? Well, it was showtime. Without much effort, Yeom Sung Gae started crying, saying he just wanted his mother to come back. If that woman left, maybe his mother would return. Even the demon was stunned by the boy's performance. He had truly played a strong hand. He really acted like a child, and this was as easy as taking candy from one. She grabbed her purse and started stuffing it with the money. As expected, she fell for it like a clueless duck into a trap. With that, the sin of betrayal against his father was complete. She asked for the bank and card passwords, but he said that wouldn't be necessary, not in the hell she was about to go to. The woman turned to look at him, confused, and the key began to glow. Sung Gai inserted and turned it. Lightning spread across the room and a door appeared. A sinister click was heard and the door opened. Scaled tentacles appeared out of nowhere and began binding the traitor, dragging her straight to hell as she screamed in despair. But her screams vanished the moment the door closed. Sung Gai had just sent a living person directly to hell. She landed in a concrete room, completely inescapable. Suddenly, the walls began to close in, making the space tighter and tighter. Baphomet watched everything through his viewer. He asked if Sung Gai wanted to see, but the boy said he was feeling a bit nauseous. The demon asked if he was feeling guilty about what he'd done, but he was caught off guard when he saw that human laughing. Sung Gai rushed to put on his school uniform. Having been secluded for so long, he was thinner than expected. The demon stared in disbelief. It hadn't even been an hour since he'd sent that woman to hell, and he was already moving on to his next target. In response, the boy said that as long as the sword was in his hands, he would keep fighting. After all, an empty hell was no hell at all. Doing it for personal satisfaction might be questionable. But in the end, Baphomet had to agree. The screams of the damned are what make hell real, and filling it with more souls would be sophisticated. Sung Gai zipped up his backpack and got ready to leave. It had been 3 months since he last went to school, and without hesitation, he left home in search of the next sinner. Little by little, the hell of betrayal was growing in population. This was turning out to be more exciting than he'd imagined. Already at school, room 2, row 4, several people looked out the window. Someone joked, asking if it was some kind of celebrity, and they answered, saying Sung Gai was back. No one could believe what they were seeing. He really was back, but hadn't he dropped out of school? Why did he return? Everyone wondered. However, the real concern was that everyone knew the school gang would go after him again. And as expected, they weren't going to let his return slide. Everyone knew the atmosphere in the room was going to turn bad again. They were anxious to see what would happen, and how his return would affect everything. But Sung Gai had a different plan in mind for Kim Sung Kwan and his gang. They opened the door with their target already in sight. "The idiot really came back," said the leader. They surrounded him, saying he should have warned them he was coming. They would have prepared a warm welcome. Baphomet misunderstood the whole thing, thinking that Sung Gai was actually popular and a celebrity among the students. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. One of the gang members threw the protagonist's notebook on the ground. He complained, saying that thanks to him, he now had a stain on his school record. If he caused trouble, he had to pay. "If you don't want to become entertainment for everyone here, you better come with us quietly," said one of the boys. They all went to the boys' bathroom, around 5 against 1. What a cowardly setup. The annoying one kept whining about his school record. They were trying to put the blame for beating up Sung Gai on the victim himself, as if Sung Hwan had just been an unlucky guy caught in the middle. Silent as ever, he remained quiet while listening to all that nonsense, and just as expected, the first punch landed straight on his face. That silence was really bothering the big guy. Baphomet watched the events unfold as if it were playing on a cinema screen. So this was what they called cornering the victim. Well, judging by how things are going, it'll be hard to make any of them commit the sin of betrayal, he commented. So what would Sung Gai do after all? He wiped the blood from his mouth. His goal was obvious, to send them all to hell. As the demon had said, there was no trust between him and the bullies, so he couldn't manipulate a sin of betrayal that involved himself. But humans had always used weapons to take down creatures far bigger than themselves. He just had to use his head. And for this hunt, the most powerful weapon he could use against them was actually pretty simple. The gang laughed at him when they saw him reaching into his pocket, thinking he had brought a knife for self-defense. But to everyone's surprise, he pulled out 5,000 reis. What he would use against the group was the power of money. But there was no reason to try and bribe them. They could just beat him up and take the money afterward. "I'll take the beating, that's fine, but it's really unfair for you to do this," he said. Baphomet got excited with the way things were going. Sung Guy threw the stack of money on the floor. Besides the beating, he had only one request to make. Sung Hwan gritted his teeth and went in for the attack, but was stopped midway. The leader said they should hear him out. After all, there was money involved. Just like the protagonist wanted, they had taken the bait. He bent down and picked up the money, saying that if he managed to hand over 5 grand just like that, then he probably had more where that came from. "So what's your request?" he asked. He looked at Kim Sung-kwan and said his request was for them to beat him up. Everyone turned to look at the boy from before, who was now in shock. If that amount wasn't enough, he had more in his pocket. "Let's destroy Kim Sung-hwan, who betrayed me when we were still friends," said Sung Guy. His trap was set. It was time for the hunt. A laugh echoed. "Maybe this idiot is actually interesting," said the leader. He stuffed the money into his pocket. He congratulated Kim Sung-kwan for his last performance of denial, but it seemed that in the end, the two really were friends. "A little act of payback. Consider the next few minutes as just that," he added. The big guy tried to hold the boy, but he dodged his arm. "What the hell are you talking about?" He tried to defend himself. "We were never friends. Why are you trusting scum like Sung Guy?" "Scum? We're just taking a bit of money from a friend. What's so hard to understand?" The leader answered shamelessly. Kim Sung-kwan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked furiously at the boy on the floor. He grabbed him by the collar, asking who he thought he was to drag him into that mess, and how he had the nerve to do that to a friend. What kind of friend was he even talking about anyway? But then Sung Guy corrected himself. Since they were childhood friends, it was only fair to go through that horrible experience together. The brown-haired boy got pissed and went to hit the protagonist, but was stopped. Someone grabbed his collar and threw him aside with force. Well, they had been paid to do this. It was time to deliver. He tried to negotiate the price per punch to see how many it would take to add up to 5,000. And Sung Guy agreed to the idea of 500 reais per punch, which would give around 10 hits. Without waiting even a second more, they started counting the hits while he watched. So this is how people felt watching others get physically humiliated. The sound was softer than what he remembered when he was the one getting beaten. "How annoying," he commented. "Why did those guys find this so fun?" He reached into his pocket for the key, creating conflict within the gang and making them betray each other. It was a very different move from what he did with his stepmother, Baphomet noted. The human prepared to open the portal and called the gang's attention. It was like they'd been stung. They all turned to look at Sung Guy at once. They asked what he was doing, and the protagonist simply replied that it was time to see how brave they really were. He inserted the key and the portal began to form. He turned around, and the iron door opened. The tentacles appeared again, grabbing them one by one, and all were pulled inside, but one still tried to hold on. But Sung Guy would show no mercy after all. The leader was known by the other students as a demon. Scenes of what they had done to him flashed through his mind. Every humiliation, every punch, every moment of psychological torment. Now that trash was surely going to feel right at home. He pried off the last finger of the leader holding onto the door, and he was completely devoured. The only one left was Kim Sung-kwan, who trembled like a chihuahua. Sung Guy turned to face his former friend. Baphomet watched the two boys, intrigued. The protagonist slowly approached while the other backed away in fear. Wasn't he curious about what had just happened, he asked. It might sound unreal, but he had just opened the gates of hell. He'd received the key just a few hours ago. Kim Sung-hwan then asked if he was being spared. At that moment, distant memories of the two from their childhood crossed his mind. Those had been such tender and happy days. He returned to reality, not knowing what the other thought of him now, but despite everything, he still considered him a friend. So that beating he took before, that was enough. Kim Sung-hwan said the other might not believe it, but he had been afraid of those guys too. Hearing that was a relief. They might slowly be able to rebuild the friendship they once had. The protagonist was leaving, but he accidentally dropped the key on the floor. Upon seeing it, Kim Sung-hwan remembered what his friend had said and what that key could do. Without thinking twice, he rushed to the key and picked it up. "You idiot, don't start acting all high and mighty after sending them to beat me up," he said. But when he opened his hand to look at the key, he saw it was just a regular key. Sung Guy had deliberately dropped his room key. The real one was still in his hand. He had truly lost his chance at redemption, and one more sinner was dragged into the hell of betrayal. Baphomet applauded. That had been quite the show, full of twists, until the very end. But he said the last one wasn't meant to be a trap. It was a test. He truly wanted to give his old friend a chance. The one who had betrayed him was now a rock bottom. Though in hell there wasn't exactly a rock bottom, everyone suffered the same. But still, well, things were about to get boring again. It was time to make hell a bit more chaotic once more. Sung-gi washed his face, still gradually coming to terms with his new reality. The demon commented that he couldn't figure him out, which intrigued him greatly. When he sent the stepmother to hell, he thought he was some kind of vengeful evil being. But when he saw his classmate, he let his emotions speak, as if he were repulsed by what he'd done. Well, he was the last being who would judge him for that, but some might feel suffocated in a way. Sung-gi turned off the water and said Baphomet could relax. He wasn't going to let any of that mess with his head. That discomfort he was feeling wasn't because he felt pity or guilt. He felt pathetic for not having erased those traitors from his life sooner, for letting them ruin it. More and more, that human surprised him. Baphomet was thoroughly impressed. He had made the right choice. The sun was setting over the city, and now he was finally home. But he couldn't say everything was in perfect shape. After all, there was a demon with his head sticking out the living room window in a very non-traditional way. It looked like he was watching a man enter the building. As soon as he was sure who it was, the demon announced that Sung-gi's father had just arrived. The young man remained silent, thinking. Baphomet was very excited to see what the next trap he would set would be, because clearly there was no bond of trust with his father, considering he had been reclusive for almost 6 months. And the money trap wouldn't work, since the money he had used belonged to the old man. Sung-gi said he didn't intend to use that kind of trap. He knew very well it wouldn't work. They both heard someone opening the door and entering the apartment. Baphomet was practically begging for a spoiler. The door opened slightly. It seemed that Sung-gi's father owned a small insurance company, and that company had very high premium rates. In other words, he made a living by denying payouts to people who regularly paid for premium insurance. His father arrived and asked who he was talking to. As if it wasn't enough to be locked up in your room playing video games, now you've developed schizophrenia, he said. Looks like you're becoming a failure just like your mother, the old man added. Sung-gi looked at the key glowing in his pocket and held it up to Baphomet. As he had said before, there was no need to use any trap on his father. Another victim had just been betrayed by that man today. Upon hearing what his son said, the old man prepared to teach him a lesson. But before he could complete the motion of the slap, Sung-gi activated the portal. He had thought about why his father had abandoned his mother, and why he was always so cruel to his own son. It seemed that his routine of denying people their rights had turned betrayal into a habit. The young man finished turning the key, and the iron gate opened once again. His father was confused by it all. It didn't take much. With just a goodbye, another sinner was being dragged into the hell he had created. The old man pleaded to be let go, but his son replied that where he was going, there was no escape. The gates closed, and the only thing left were faint remnants of screams coming from behind them. Baphomet watched the prison where the man had been sent, but aside from the sounds coming from his screen, silence reigned in the room. Sung-gi stood up and walked to a picture frame that had fallen on the shelf. It was an old family photo. The demon asked if his revenge was over and what his next plans were. He was very anxious. His revenge was over, and without anyone expecting such a twist, he said it was now time to turn himself in to the police. Already at the station, he told the officers everything he had done, with Baphomet accompanying him. Suddenly a portal opened and one of his subordinates appeared. It seemed that Lucifer wanted to speak to him. It was probably to discuss the new hell that had just been created. He got up and opened the portal so he could go speak with the boss. The castle of the King of Hell appeared, and a council made up of 11 demons was waiting for Baphomet. The doors opened and he entered the grand hall. A smooth voice echoed, saying that now all 12 had arrived. That voice belonged to none other than Lucifer himself, King of Hell. Lucifer was seated on his throne, watching the arrival of the master of the 20th Hell. Baphomet looked around the room, wondering why all 12 demons, who normally didn't get along at all, were gathered there. Lucifer asked him to take a seat. He walked to his chair, but before sitting down, he asked for an explanation since he had been the last to arrive. But with no patience whatsoever, the king ordered him to sit. A magic circle opened and Baphomet was pulled down into his seat. Everyone was sitting there because Lucifer had commanded it. No one was there willingly. That was Gargamon, one of the high-ranking demons. It looked like they were going to discuss some new rules about the hells, something none of the demons present were happy about. The king said he had given each of them the opportunity to create their own hell. But as with any contract, at no point did he ever say that each of them would own their own hell. In other words, he never promised that the hell they created would become the official hell. A woman named Lizanne joined the conversation and said that the hells they created would then be their responsibility, but they would not be official hells. Exactly, said Lucifer, and the most interesting part of it all was that none of them had created their hell alone. They had all hired a human of interest to help with the creation. Baphomet thought the others wouldn't have had the same insight he did, but it actually made sense. In the end, the most grandiose hell ever created was the hell of disbelief, planned by Dante, a human. A strange eye began to move, as if it wanted to speak. That was Sadius, another high-ranking demon, and he wanted to know what Master Lucifer had in mind. He answered that it was quite simple. He would choose the best hell to become part of the official hell, and the rest would be exterminated. Everyone was shocked to hear that, and what they feared was true. Lucifer wanted a battle to take place between the creators of those hells. Back at the police station, Sung Guy was now in the interrogation room. He had gone to the station to create confusion in the investigation and reported the disappearance of his father and stepmother. But not everything went as expected. There had been a report about the disappearance of a group of bullies. Desperate parents were begging for their children to be found. In the end, 6 people had vanished in the same neighborhood in just one day, and he was the only link between all of them. So why hadn't he acted with more caution from the start? Why had he done everything all at once, within just a day or two? Well, the explanation was obvious, because there was no way they could convict him as guilty. The only connection was between him and the missing people. There wasn't a single living soul who had seen him open the gates of hell, and much less any evidence like weapons or bodies to be found. There are always links between missing people, but the law wasn't simple enough to convict someone based on that alone. Sung Gae smiled. He would likely be released soon. The junior investigator told his senior that despite everything they tried, they had no evidence against that boy. What were they going to do? An amateur like him couldn't have hidden all the evidence without leaving a single trace like that. Well, in this situation, the only thing they could do was let the boy go, said Detective Chief Park Sang-sik. But before that, he wanted to have one more word with the kid and asked his subordinate to turn off the microphone. He opened the door to the room where Sung Guy was and apologized for all that happening right after the disappearance of his parents. Park Sang-sik tossed out a bait, saying they weren't doing it because they wanted to. He was convinced the boy hadn't killed anyone. Sung Guy remained silent. He really hadn't killed anyone, only sent them to hell. He was surprised to hear his own voice, as he was sure he had only thought that, not spoken it. But in front of him, the detective was holding a strange key, just like his own. Park Sang-sik asked if he was surprised. It seemed that Sung Guy wasn't the only one chosen by a commander from hell. The boy was truly in shock. That was the last thing he'd expected. The detective said he was surprised too, but he didn't expect a confession like that to come so easily. He approached Sung Ji while the young man was lost in conflicting thoughts. That man's intuition really seemed sharp, and he couldn't tell if he had gotten close knowing something, or if he just took a chance and caught him off guard. But putting all that aside, one thing was certain. As the two stared at each other, Sung Guy thought that if necessary, he'd just send the guy to hell like the others. Manipulating a sin of betrayal against that detective couldn't be too hard. Suddenly, both were surprised by a portal opening, and Baphomet appeared in the middle of the interrogation. On the other side of the room, another portal opened, and Gargamel made his entrance. Sung Gi was shocked to see another demon. "Looks like we've met again," said Gargamel. As they could see, the humans the two of them had chosen had ended up crossing paths. The masked demon said it was good they had met again, but that Baphomet should keep better control of his pet, because it seemed his little nerd was ready to open the gates of hell at any moment. The horned demon told his human to stay calm. The games hadn't even begun yet. Sung Gai asked what was going on. He hadn't expected that there were other humans like him. Baphomet responded, saying he hadn't expected it either, but just like him, it seemed the other demons were also using humans to create their hells, and only one of the 12 created hells would be the winner. Therefore, the game of death would soon begin. Gargamel told the detective to let the boy go for now, because if he were released, he could potentially deal with other opponents, reducing the number of competitors. The detective said he had already been considering letting him go because legally, there was no way to prove the kid's crimes. Besides, he was also using powers from hell, which made him just as much a criminal as Sung Gai. Baphomet added that they were human after all, and that made them useful. But Gargamel was right. If they started using their powers too early, it would be hard to survive until the end of the game. Well, if they allowed it, Baphomet still had a lot to explain to his human. The detective opened the door, and the two of them left together. Sung Gai seemed outraged to learn there were other humans like him. Still in the room, the man holding hands said Park Sang-sik didn't need to worry. His hell was much better than the other two. For now, they just use the others as scapegoats and defeat them when necessary. Park Sang-sik said he'd do whatever it took to survive until the end, because only then would a just society be formed. It was already nighttime by the time Sung Gai got home. He collapsed on his bed, shaken by the fact that the guy had not only discovered his power, but was also a creator of hells. The young man shouted that he could have been arrested, or worse, sent to hell. Baphomet told him to cut the drama since it was the human himself who had chosen to turn himself in to the police. Sung Gi tried to shift the blame, accusing Baphomet of not informing him about other humans like him. But before he could keep whining, the demon grabbed him by the face and slammed him against the wall. Sung Gai had better watch his mouth. He wasn't dealing with just anyone, but with a superior demon who could steal his soul in a blink. The boy swallowed hard, and Baphomet let go of him. The demon was just as angry, because he hadn't known that Lucifer had ordered the other demons to create their own hells too. Much less that he'd tell all 12 to fight one another to determine which one was the best. His rage at Lucifer's decision was more than obvious. Sung Gai asked about the game of death, trying to confirm if the goal was simply to survive until the end, and Baphomet asked if the human really thought he was capable of that. But first, the young man needed to learn the rules of the game and what had happened while he was being interrogated at the police station. The demon agreed with him and said he'd show him. He raised 2 fingers to Sung Gai's eyes, making him curse from the pain. Unfortunately, that method of showing was better than explaining. Everything went dark, and then a light appeared. An image of a man began to form in his vision, and out of nowhere Lucifer was in front of him. Sung Gi could see everything happening in full detail, as if he were right there in that moment. Someone raised their hand and said that Lucifer's thirst for war was a great idea. That man was Lamb, the flaming eagle. But in order to prepare, he continued, they needed to know the rules of the game. Lucifer seemed to think about it. What he actually wanted was for the chosen humans to fight and send each other to hell. You don't know the sin tied to each other's hell, just like your humans don't know either. Manipulate your chosen ones and make them set traps to send their opponents here. In other words, it would be a game of tag where you don't know who your enemies are, and the last one standing is the winner, Lamb explained. Lucifer agreed with what that demon had said. That way, they could see which of the hells was truly universal, and how unique a hell created by a human could be. Lamb raised his hand again and asked if there were any other rules besides that, and the king said they couldn't use their own demon powers to help the humans. Any other method was allowed, as long as it was the humans who sent each other to hell. The vision dissolved, and he returned to reality. Now he understood why the game was called the Game of Death, because there was no choice. Even if he wasn't the hunter, someone would come after him eventually. Baphomet agreed, saying that rule applied to him as well. After all, demons are connected to their own hells by contract, meaning, along with the humans, all the demons would cease to exist, except for one. It really was a lot of information to process, but in truth, Yeom Sung-gi couldn't care less about Baphomet's life. Even if he ended up in someone else's hell, he would take it as karma coming back to him. There was only one concern in his mind, and he decided to ask Baphomet. What would happen to the people trapped in his hell if he ended up imprisoned in one of his opponent's hells? Well, that answer was simple. They would disappear too. So there was no easy way out. Yeom Sung-gi had to get his best, because he didn't want those bastards who were imprisoned to have a peaceful death. Baphomet shivered at those words. The young man he had chosen was insane. He didn't want to survive to save himself, but to ensure that his sinners kept suffering. Ensuring eternal suffering was the essence of hell. There was no way he could let what he had created fall apart like that. Right or wrong, Baphomet was glad to have a human like him by his side. Maybe becoming the master of a new hell wasn't such a distant dream after all. The demon reached out his hand and said he recognized him as his partner, and the two saluted each other. But from afar, it seemed someone was literally watching them. Sadius and his human, Min Che, were standing on top of a building, observing them from a distance. It seemed the games were really about to begin. Yeom Sung-gi wrote the rules on a sheet of paper. Summed up, there were 4 rules. Rule 1. Victory is decided when one creator imprisons the other. Rule 2. Demons can help, but without using their powers. Rule 3. Any method can be used. And Rule 4. The process continues until there is one winner left. Unless Lucifer changed his mind and added more rules, those were the conditions. So here came the first question. To what extent could the demons help? Aside from authoritarian power, what other abilities did they have? Asked Yeom Sung-gi. Well, the authoritarian power was the power Lucifer had given to each of them, such as the ability to move through portals, the hellfire they could emit from their bodies, and the power to command lower demons. But besides this authoritarian power, each demon had a unique ability, the one they were born with. Yeom Sung-gi became curious about that, and asked what Baphomet's innate ability was. He answered that his ability was to detect death. Since childhood, he had always been able to sense those near death and guide them to hell. Intrigued, the boy asked if he could explain in more detail how that ability worked. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Yeom Sung-gi wasn't expecting anyone. He answered the intercom and saw that a girl was at his door. She said she had something to show him. Not really understanding what that meant, he replied with a yes, and out of nowhere, she began to unbutton her blouse. Caught off guard, Yeom Sung-gi asked what she was doing and told her to leave before he called the police, then hung up the intercom. Baphomet stuck his head out of his room, and suddenly a miasma began to fill the space. That was the essence of death, just like he had mentioned earlier. That woman at the intercom had come to try and take Yeom Sung-gi's life. The boy was surprised to hear that, but soon his brain kicked into gear. He'd been reclusive and hadn't done anything to justify a stranger coming to kill him, so there was only one answer. That woman was definitely also a hell creator. Min Che took the glowing key from her pocket. Yeom Sung-gi's reaction had been enough for the sin of lust to be activated. She put the key back in her pocket, and now all she had to do was break the door down and invade the house to send her opponent to hell. As a precaution, the girl confirmed with her demon, and Sadius simply nodded yes. His observation skills really were amazing. He had found a creator faster than she expected. And since he hadn't come out, all she had to do was go in, and it would be over. Min Che raised her hammer and began smashing it against the door. Yeom Sung-gi was shocked by the audacity of that woman. She was literally hammering his door. He needed to think fast of a way to fight her, because her key had definitely been activated. It didn't take much thought for him to realize that the sin tied to her was lust. The knocking on his door continued relentlessly. He grabbed his key and started trying to think of a plan. When he answered the intercom, he didn't know she was also one of his opponents, so he couldn't prepare in advance. Could that act count as a sin of betrayal? Baphomet explained that what she did was still too shallow to be considered a sin. For the key to be activated, the opponent had to abandon their faith. Obviously, a casual action like that didn't equate to the sin of betrayal, even if it was intentional. The rules of hell weren't that lenient, but Yeom-sung Gai seemed very calm, so Baphomet asked if he still had another card up his sleeve. Another hammer blow echoed against his door. The other party had already activated their key and intended to enter the house, said the protagonist as he approached the door until he stood in front of it. He had to make her believe he was capable of summoning his power the moment the door opened. The young man sat in front of the door and warned the woman outside that if she came in, she would go straight to hell. Though confused for a second, she concluded he was bluffing, and continued hammering the door. The girl confirmed what he had already guessed. She was forcing her way in because she had already triggered the conditions to open her hell's door. She finally managed to break the doorknob. Yeom-sung Gi gave her a second warning, saying that if she stepped in, she'd fall directly into his hell. Hu Min-chae definitely wasn't expecting that. He wasn't begging for his life, nor was he hiding from her. So could what he was saying actually be true? She wondered. Just as expected, she fell for his bait like a duckling. He asked if she was curious to know why he wasn't running away, and began explaining that the hell he was responsible for was the hell of invasion. She looked through the hole in the door, and the two stared at each other. It was, in fact, a half-bluff, but he had to play with the cards he had. There was nothing in Lucifer's rules that said he couldn't lie about the theme of his own hell. Baphomet looked at him with admiration. Despite the short time, he had already managed to come up with a trap. But as a human with high intelligence, Hu Min-chae also knew there was a high chance that it was a lie. The probability of it being a bluff was certainly over 90%. But what if in the end, it was real? What if she really opened the door and triggered the condition for Yeom-sung Gi's hell? She imagined that scenario and convinced herself she didn't want the game to end there. A moment of silence followed as she considered all the possible outcomes. Possibility 1. Insert her key into the lock and activate her hell, but in return, it might also activate her opponent's condition. Possibility 2. Retreat, but if she did that, the other player wouldn't fall for it again. Yeom-sung Gi would remember that attack and know the condition for activating Hu Min-chae's hell. In other words, a potential checkmate. Each option carried a big risk. What should she do? It seemed like Yeom-sung Gi was reading her mind as he commented on all the doubts and possibilities that had passed through her head. Then he offered her an option that would supposedly benefit both sides, which was the option of forming an alliance. She mocked that idea. After all, there would only be one winner at the end of that game, so if they formed an alliance, at some point they'd have to betray each other. Yeom-sung Gi kept trying to persuade her, asking if she really thought she could take on the other 10 participants by herself. That comment made Hu Min-chae hesitate. She truly wouldn't be able to use the same method she had used today on every other participant. Besides, there was a chance that he could form an alliance with someone else and leak the sin behind her hell to the other players. Then she wouldn't even be able to use her surprise attacks anymore. Not knowing what to do, she asked Sadius what the best option would be. But the demon replied that he also didn't know what the best decision was. Not giving her much time to think, Yeom-sung Gi gave her his phone number and said that if she wanted to form an alliance, all she had to do was call him. That way, she wouldn't trigger the conditions of his hell. Since she had broken the door, the police were probably on their way, so she'd better leave quickly. Even though she still wasn't entirely sure about it, Hu Min-chae picked up her phone and wrote down the number Yeom-sung Gi had given her. It seemed things hadn't gone the way she wanted. Apparently, her opponents really were on the same intelligence level as her. He held it in until she left, and then dropped the act. The games had barely begun, and he had already almost been eliminated. Baphomet commented that he suspected there might be a demon with the ability to detect other users, but he hadn't expected them to be the first. But more importantly, Yum Sung-gi truly deserved praise. His quick thinking had surprised him once again. They kept talking and discussing their next steps. Yum Sung-gi was making some changes to his hell through the game when a message popped up on his phone. Hugh Min-cha had agreed to form an alliance with him for the time being. He looked at his phone, thinking that just surviving today was already a victory. If she leaked any information about their alliance or his power, Yeom Sung-ji could activate his hell of betrayal. That had really been a brilliant move. Meanwhile, at the police department, Detective Park Sang-sik was checking some confidential files. He seemed deeply focused in his research, looking for other creators like himself. Gargamon asked if he was using his power for that. It wouldn't be such a bad idea, but the number of missing people was too high, so even if he wanted to use his power, it was more complicated than expected. Someone seemed to enter his office and asked if he was already about to leave. The detective questioned what his assistant was doing there at that hour, and the young man replied he was just doing a small restock. The young man opened the drawer to put away his bag and took the chance to mention that earlier they'd received a report of an attempted break-in at Yeom Sung-gi's house. It seems some crazy student had tried to invade his home. When the police arrived at the scene, the victim was fine and the girl had already left. Finally, he had a lead. He was sure the girl who went after Yeom Sung-gi was also a hell creator. Who would have thought that nerd was doing so well? He asked them to pull up the camera footage to find out who the girl that attacked the property was. In addition to the footage, the detective had one more request. He wanted his subordinate to keep an eye on the boys' movements throughout the week. But while the players who already knew each other's identities were analyzing one another, in another part of the city, the first elimination occurred. An old man was kneeling while a well-dressed man stood in front of him. It seemed that the man standing was Jam's player. The old man begged the young man to save him and complained to his demon, saying he wasn't the kind to commit sins. But the well-dressed man approached the old man, saying that sometimes your very existence is a sin. The fact that the old man was using up oxygen with his useless life was something that man simply couldn't tolerate. Even as he pleaded for mercy, the gates of hell opened and his soul was sucked in. His demon began to disappear, saying that this time Jam had gotten lucky. But before he could say anything else, the human stepped on the pink demon and called him incompetent. Jam asked him to stop. Like it or not, that demon under his foot was from the upper ranks of hell. But without any fear, the man turned to him and said that if he didn't want that to happen, he'd better do his job right. The half-eagle demon stared in disbelief, wondering if he had really heard that correctly. But the human retracted his words, saying he was just kidding. They were partners after all. Well, now there were only 10 participants left. If they could capture them all, their utopia would finally be created. 3 days had passed since the incident with Fabiana, and Yeom Sung-gi had taken the time to rest as if he were on vacation from work. Baphomet stared at him, trying to understand what the human strategy was. 3 days ago, not only had they survived 2 competitors, but they had also formed an alliance, and yet surprisingly, nothing had been done since then. If they wanted to be the winners, shouldn't they be taking action? Yeom Sung-gi said he understood his frustration. He wasn't the type to just sit and wait either, so he was feeling restless too. The demon then asked why the humans seemed so relaxed. Well, first off, a game like this was progressive. Toward the end, there was usually no time to rest or even gather information. In other words, once the game truly began, the two of them definitely wouldn't be able to sleep, always either the hunted or the hunter. Secondly, if he was starting to lose patience, then someone was bound to make a mistake. After all, there were always idiots who preferred to win the battle rather than the war. So he wanted to begin the hunt only when an aggressive player was drawn into one of his traps. His phone started ringing. It looked like Hugh Min-che was calling. Over the phone, she complained that it had been 3 days since they formed the alliance and he hadn't contacted her once. He replied that he had been strategically doing nothing, waiting for someone to commit the sin of invasion. She sighed in frustration and commented that while he was off the grid, an incident had already happened. Apparently, something interesting had been posted on Streamer, and he needed to see it. Hugh Min-chae sent the link so Yeon Sung-gi could also watch the video. A streamer named Gagaka appeared on his screen, and during his livestream, he said he was participating in some kind of game. Not just any game, but one similar to the Hunger Games, where none of the participants knew each other's identities. And since everyone's strategy seemed to be the same, hiding until someone made the first move, the game wasn't exciting at all. Being someone enthusiastic, he had expected this game of death to be filled with more screams and chases, so he decided to reveal his identity first. That way the start would finally be triggered, and participants could choose between stealing his key or hunting down other players who targeted him. So he invited everyone to his house that very night at midnight, leaving the exact location in the comments. Baphomet and Yeon Sung-gi stared at the phone, not believing what they had just seen. Just like they'd been waiting, it was time to take the first step. Of course, in an event like that, they could identify other players, and it would be a great opportunity to reduce the numbers. It looked like the vacation was over. In a cafe in the middle of the city, Yeon Sung-gi was waiting for Hugh Min-chae. She, of course, arrived complaining about his appearance and asked if he chose such a busy place just to keep her from attacking him. In return, he said he had left his own house to meet her, so he was the one at a disadvantage since he couldn't activate the Sin invasion. She sat down and got straight to the point, asking what they were going to do about that streamer's invitation. Besides regular people, other creators like them had probably also seen the video. Possibly one or two players were definitely going to show up. So what would be the best strategy? Yeon Sung-gi thought about what to do. He didn't want her to discover the true activation condition of his sin. He decided to say he would go. Even though his sin wasn't very effective, it would still be a good chance to discover other players' identities. That actually wasn't a bad idea. They just needed to check the location as soon as the address was posted in the comments. But before they could continue, something unexpected happened. Detective Park Sang-sik arrived at the cafe along with his demon, Gargamon. Yeon Sung-gi wondered why he had shown up there, and Hugh Min-chae turned around, coming face to face with another player. The detective smiled at them both and said he found it cute that they were sitting in a public place, discussing what to do. For a second, both young players felt a wave of panic and exchanged glances, but it seemed the detective was being friendly. Even so, it was natural to wonder, how long had he been watching them, and how did he have the guts to show up? Even without knowing their sins, had they done something that might have triggered his key's condition to send them to hell? They both wondered. Park Sang-sik finished the drink that used to be Yeon Sung-gi's and told them to stop whatever it was they were thinking of doing. He warned them that if they continued, both of them would end up in hell right then and there. Meanwhile, at streamer Gagaka's house, he checked the reach of his video and whether he had written the address correctly. Now all he had to do was post it and wait. His demon, Jin Jiang, asked if they were really going to go through with that plan. The boy smiled and, very excited, confirmed that they were definitely going to follow through with it. After all, he had already placed the cameras in their proper positions. Besides, Jin Jiang's ability wasn't useful for much else. And so, the first major event in that game of death was set into motion, and Gagaka's strategy preparation was complete. At the cafe, the three remained seated, motionless. His key was glowing, which meant someone had committed the sin that activates his power. But when could that have happened? Since the announcement in that video about the games, he had tried not to commit a single sin. Yeon Sung-gi remembered a detail. At the police station, his key wasn't activated when he showed it. So could it have been reacting to Hugh Min-chae and not him? He looked at the woman in front of him when suddenly a hypothesis formed in his mind. Yeon Sung-gi tried to get Hugh Min-chae's attention, but he was interrupted by Park Sang-sik, who seemed to have something to say. Even so, he stood up. The detective gave the boy one last warning, but Yeon Sung-gi said he was bluffing. If his theory was correct, the detective had threatened someone to activate a sin and used that moment to approach them. because if neither he nor Hugh Minche had committed sins, the other could only be bluffing, and with a sinner in the cafe, all the pieces fit. That explained why his key was active in that place. Besides, Yeom Sung Guy hadn't seen him check his key at any point since entering the cafe. He noticed an obviously anxious man sitting nearby, and that bell on the table hadn't been there for long. Yeom Sung Guy walked over to the man and went straight to the point, asking if he had entered the cafe after being threatened by Park Sang-sik. Hoo Min-chae stood up in outrage when she realized it had all been a setup, and our protagonist confirmed his hypothesis. "Will you think you would treat us like that?" the girl complained. The man who had been used took the opportunity to confirm with the detective and rushed out of the place. Park Sang-sik gave a faint smile, which startled Yeom Sung Guy. The detective said the boy had really grown, or maybe last time they'd met, he had been so overwhelmed that he let something slip. What could that guy be planning? But then he stood up and told them it had all been a test. After all, he didn't want to ally himself with two idiots. Even so, Yeom Sung Guy didn't let it go and remained suspicious of him. But in a friendly tone, he asked the two young people to sit back down and hear his proposal. As if there were no tension at all between them, now the detective was drinking from Hoo Min-chae's coffee, making it all seem like the most normal thing in the world. She asked the nerd if they were really going to listen to what the detective had to say. After all, they didn't have much time. But the reason Yeom Sung Guy hadn't stood up and left was precisely because that guy was a detective. Because of that, he had the ability to find hell creators like the two of them through police case records. Besides, there was still a possibility of him forcibly detaining or restricting someone using his public authority. In short, players like them who only had one card to play were at a disadvantage against the detective, because he had two. So forming an alliance with him would be a good move, and considering the battle to come, having one more brain on the team would be an advantage. Yeom Sung Gi made his move and said he'd agree to an alliance if the detective revealed what his sin was. Well, asking for his sin like that wasn't something he could just hand over on a silver platter. Hoo Min-chae commented that forming an alliance without knowing each other's sins wasn't a good idea. But the detective went on, saying that instead of revealing his sin, he had some excellent information to share with them. Like it or not, both were interested in the offer. The detective continued his speech by asking if the number of people they had sent to hell was still in the single digits, because so far he had sent 117 people to hell. As expected, Yeom Sung Guy and Hoo Min-chae were shocked by that information, but they ended up disturbing the other people in the cafe and apologized for the exaggerated reaction. So having sent so many people to hell, he had managed to gather some information about how key activation works, like how long the key stays active, how far the person can be, and even how many people they can send at once. And the more people he captured, the more information he managed to gather. So the proposal was that he would share that information with the two of them in exchange for forming an alliance during the battle that was going to take place that night. Obviously, the two end up accepting the proposal and make their exit. Gargamon reappears, questioning whether Park Sang-sik hadn't given away too much information for an alliance, considering how hard he had worked to get it. But he says the demon shouldn't worry because the notebook he lent them had some important numbers switched, and if they ever betrayed him, Park Sang-sik would be able to devour both of them at once. At night, in a park in the middle of the city, Yeom Sung Guy and Hoo Min-chae wait for the announcement of Vigaka's location, with 3 hours and 20 minutes remaining until the official release. But while they waited, it was a good time to start thinking about their teamwork. He calls Hoo Min-chae's attention and says he has a few questions to ask. About her key's ability, could she use it now? Because if they identify Gagaka's location first, they might gain some advantage before the other participants arrived. In response, Hoo Min-chae picks up a stick and starts drawing on the ground. As she explains, her demon's ability is to locate the nearest demon to them. In other words, she could only track the demon of the closest player within a certain range. So that night she had come to him because he was the nearest player within her ability's radius. He asks how often she can activate her power, and she says it's every 12 hours for 5 minutes. Since she knew he would be home the whole time, she likely used her ability every 12 hours while moving through the city. Most likely, since the day they met, she hadn't made contact with any other players out of caution due to the fight they had. So Yeom Sung-gae concludes that there were more people she had tracked but hadn't told him about. She wanted to keep that information to herself, but during the cafe incident, he had saved her. Therefore, it was only fair to repay the favor. Hu Min-cha takes a deep breath and then exhales. Her hunt had produced 2 results. One of them was at the immigration gate at the airport, and the other was inside the meeting room of QS Corporation. In other words, one of the players was probably a foreigner, and the other held a high-ranking position in the QS conglomerate. Unfortunately, neither of them looked into a mirror during the 5 minutes she had, so she didn't know what they looked like. Just to be clear, she said she hadn't mentioned it earlier not because she didn't trust him, but because she had genuinely forgotten. She definitely didn't want to break the alliance. He thanks her and says that to strengthen their trust, he would explain a bit more about his abilities. What Baphomet could do was track the essence of death. In his case, it alerted him when someone wanted to kill, so if used properly, it could predict the future. That wasn't a bad ability at all, especially combined with the sin of his ki. Hu Min-cha comments. Well, now that they knew each other a bit more, and there were still 3 hours left until the official release, it was best to separate so they could rest before the battle. She agrees, and Yeom Sung-gae says he'll send a photo of the detective's notebook so she can study it too. He raises his hand for a friendly high five and tells her to survive. After all, just like him, she wouldn't want her prisoners to have an easy death. That makes her remember why her sin's theme was lust. In a room, a cell phone is set up with the camera on, resting on a desk. A young man appears on the screen, and Hu Min-cha, in the background, asks why the camera is on. He says it would be fun because of the adrenaline and asks her to do it just this once for him. The next day, at her school, 2 guys suddenly start hunting her down. Inside her locker, several slurs had been written. It was easy to understand what had really happened from there. A man rubs his hands together. Standing before Hu Min-cha is her ex, apologizing and begging for mercy. But she says it was far too late. The damage was done, and her family had been destroyed because of him. Hu Min-cha returns to reality and agrees that Yeon Sung-gae was right. She couldn't let the people in her hell die so easily. The two give each other a friendly high five and say they will survive until the end. Yeom Sung-gae was analyzing the notebook the detective had given him and making some notes when suddenly Baphomet appeared in his room. He begged the human to stop making him walk so much because his feet were hurting. After all, he was only used to moving through portals. In response, Yeom Sung-gae told him to stop whining, since other creators could also see demons. So Baphomet had to stay hidden to avoid being easily found. Considering how cautious he was being, the demon commented, "Wasn't he trusting Sadia's partner a bit too much?" He said he didn't see a problem, since he had lied about his real sin. Besides that, he needed her power for the battle. It was definitely going to be a numbers game, and other demons had probably formed alliances too. Somewhere in the city, Lam and 2 other demons were walking around, which proved Yeon Sung-gae's theory right. Those 3 were Lam, Bamfer, and Gordon Kilius. However, the alliance between them was different from the team of Yeom Sung-gae, Hu Min-cha, and Park Sang-sik. Yu Ning-han was clearly the leader of the 3 and treated the other 2. And Yeon Hai and Jeon Jong-cheol as his subordinates. He seemed to be constantly refreshing Gagaka's video feed, and finally, the address was posted. Yu Ning-han called out to Jeon Jong-cheol, tossed a key into his hands, and ordered him to drive them to the location. He also told the girl who was kneeling that she would be the first to enter the place Gagaka had sent them to. And Yeon Hai asked why she had to go first. But before she could keep talking, he showed her the glowing key and said it was because she was incompetent and her life belonged to him. She was clearly uncomfortable with that threat. It was awful to have to follow orders from a bastard like him. Jeon Jong-cheol asked if they would be free after completing the task, and Yu Ning-han replied that he'd release them anytime, as long as they became useful people, so they didn't need to worry. That way, all the participants were now heading toward the place Gagaka had posted. Let the games begin. The city looked peaceful at night, without the bustle of people passing through the streets like during the day. Yeom Seung-gi's group was now gathered near a parking lot. They were discussing the information written in the notebook the detective had given them. It seemed they could only drag up to 5 people at a time into hell. When the hell gate closes, it has a 1-minute cooldown before it can be opened again. The maximum distance between the gate and the sinner is 10 meters. Even if the target is visible, if it's not within range, they won't be dragged in. Hu Minche commented that he had forgotten one detail. Even if the key recognizes someone as a sinner, if the creator doesn't acknowledge that person's sin, they won't be dragged in. In other words, there were 2 conditions for the gate to work. The target must sin, and the creator must recognize them as a sinner. It seemed they had studied thoroughly, so the team's first goal was to spot and identify the other players. Second, gather clues about the other's sins. And third, all 3 had to survive. No matter the urge to reduce player numbers, they had to make it out alive. Hu Minche asked about not taking risks to thin out the players, but Park Sang-sik replied that there was no reward for dragging other players into hell, so it wasn't worth the risk. However, if any opportunity allowed them to take someone out, they would do whatever was within their reach. He handed 2 walkie-talkies to the young pair. That way they could communicate better and warn each other if they spotted another user. In front of a luxury hotel, a car pulled up. Yu Ning-han was trying to observe the enemy's movements using binoculars. Did they really have to be the first ones to enter? They didn't even know where the attack might come from. It was better to wait until other participants showed up and let them take the first risks. The boss was already getting irritated with all that whining. They had come there to try to reduce the number of players as much as possible. And as the 2 already knew, Yu Ning-han had already sent another player to hell. One thing he'd learned from that was that when you send a creator to hell, you gain an extra ability. The 2 looked at him in disbelief. If that were true, getting an extra ability right at the start would be a huge advantage. The more cards you gather, the better your chances in the game. Soon, those 2 subordinates came to the conclusion that if they managed to eliminate another player, they could then free themselves from Yu Ning-han, or at least rise to the same level as him. As expected, the 2 of them fell for his trap like clueless fools. If there really were such a reward, the game organizer himself would have announced it. He recalls the moment of his last battle. Right after the demon disappeared, he asked Lam if he had received any kind of bonus for that. Lam replied that he hadn't been informed of any new rules nor felt any changes. In that case, there was no need to kill other players with their own hands. They needed to rethink their strategy. And it was quite simple. He would use those 2 players as bait to be taken down by the new person who had emerged, and that way he could gather information about the sin of the opponent's hell. With that, he could turn that new player into his slave and repeat the process until the end of the game. And in the end, kill his last slave to become the final winner. He gives a small cough to try and keep his expression under control, then continues his speech, saying everything he was doing was to make his allies stronger. Now they just needed to attach the cameras to their clothes and head out to battle. Meanwhile, Gagaka was watching the security footage he had installed in strategic points. Suddenly, 2 shadows form at his window. It opens and a woman enters, asking if the little kitty had been expecting her to ring the doorbell before coming in. It looked like she had used some sort of climbing rope to make that entrance. Her key was glowing, which meant they could attack. And Eon Hai raises the key and demands that the gates of the Hell of Vanity be opened. Several bats begin to appear around her. It was time for that brat to face his judgment. A giant bat positions itself, and when she turns the key, along with its wings, the portal opens. Hands reach toward Gagaka and restrain him, but suddenly they begin to retreat, surprising both the human and her demon. What could have happened? It made no sense that the key didn't work. Suddenly, a deep voice begins coming from their target's direction, and an Eon Hai couldn't believe what she was seeing. They had completely targeted the wrong person, and as a mask is removed, another demon reveals itself. The two had no idea that was even possible, and before they could think of anything else, Gagaka's hell of invasion was activated. A green smoke began to fill the space, and bound by a rope, the girl and her demoness were dragged into Gagaka's hell. Suddenly, everything goes dark, and in a dance school, a countdown can be heard. 3 girls are rehearsing. Carla looks at her phone, watching a different group of girls dancing while wondering how long she would remain a trainee. Out of nowhere, from the other side of the room, a commotion can be heard and a guy announces that the girl beside him, named Yule, will be debuting. And Manhua was shocked by the announcement and questioned why that girl was debuting before the others she had trained with. He responds that it was a decision made from above, and there was nothing he could do. So instead of complaining, why didn't she celebrate with the other girls? Whether she wanted to or not, she was crushed by the news, and someone approached her with a tissue in hand. That someone was Yule. She thought the other girl was being compassionate about her pain, but in reality, Yule tells Manhua to try improving for the next evaluation. After all, she had been a trainee for 7 years. Maybe she really didn't have the talent, and perhaps it was time to give up being an idol, because she was getting too old for that. Yule revealed herself to be a true snake in that moment. In a convenience store under the rain, Manhua drank to drown her sorrows while watching that Dan girl debuting, because she had found out that Yule had slept with the company rep, and that's why she was chosen to debut. That same night, a light began to shine in her room and a woman, clearly not human, appeared before her. She had a proposal to make, and Manhua didn't have the courage to refuse it. But when she reached her target and tried to send him to hell, she discovered she couldn't do it. Just because he was an executive from an elite company didn't mean he was a benevolent guy, and that made all of her effort look like a pathetic joke. He goes on to say that compassion is for the incompetent. He had only shown confidence based on evidence. While she was being dragged away, she thought that maybe she herself had been complacent for believing she'd survive after trusting a guy like that. And so, the terms had been fulfilled. The gate to hell was closed, and Manhua was eliminated. As soon as it all ended, the demoness responsible for her also began to dissolve. Gagaka appeared, excited with that victory. After all, everything had just been a theory to try using Jinjiang's power in their favor. He was happy with the compliment, since his power was usually only used at parties to entertain other demons. Gagaka was clearly very pleased and satisfied with the result and could hardly wait to use it again. Jinjiang put his mask back on, and they got ready to deal with the next victim. The green light of the portal's activation could be seen through the window, and Yeom-sung-gi took the chance to use the radio and alert everyone. That light had definitely come from one of the players' portals. At least one person had definitely been defeated. From that moment on, Yeom-sung-gi began building his theories. After all, according to what was written in the detective's notebook, the player who had opened that portal and probably won the battle would have to wait at least 1 minute before being able to open it again. Should he use that moment to go in? Could he enter and leave within 1 minute without getting caught? But before he could continue, someone put a hand on his shoulder, which startled him. He thought it might be another enemy player. However, it was the detective, trying to stop him from going through with that idea, since doing anything without a plan in just 1 minute would be extremely difficult. So what should they do? Park Sang-sik said it was simple. He could just ask if everything was okay, since he had heard a scream. Yeom-sung-gi tried to argue, but then he understood. The detective was trying to enter Gagaka's room using the excuse of being a detective and having received a report. Whoever had won the last battle would have trouble sending a detective to hell, because if that happened, other police officers would probably show up and taken in as a suspect. So the roles of Yeom-sung-gi and Hugh Min-chae were to prevent other players from entering. He would find a way to deal with whoever was inside, so he headed toward the building. That detective didn't just have guts, he also knew how to think fast in situations like that. The reason they had been patient until then was exactly to wait for someone to start a battle so they could have a chance to intervene. But that was making Yeom-sung-gi anxious. Before he got caught and defeated, would he be able to send that guy to hell? As expected, the first camera had vanished. The girl was gone, but now he knew the theme of the opponent's hell. He threw the tablet aside and said it was time for them to make a move too. The elevator had arrived at the 7th floor, Vigaka's apartment floor. The detective stepped out and was immediately caught on the streamer's camera. He wondered if this was an easy target. It didn't seem like one of the residents. Park Sang-sik walked up to the door and rang the bell. The young man seemed excited by the idea. After all, the door was open, so the guy just had to come in. He went back to the closet and had his demon act properly, but Park Sang-sik kept knocking and said he was a detective and had come because of a report. It had definitely been because of the earlier noises and light, thought Gigaka. That was truly a serious problem, and just as the detective had planned, the young man had exactly the line of reasoning he expected. If I send him to hell, I'll probably be arrested, and if I open the door, it'll buy time for other players to show up. Well, the sooner he dealt with this, the better. So he went to the door and asked what report the detective had received. He said it was nothing serious, just someone reporting that a woman had been heard screaming in the next room, and asked if they could talk for a moment. Meanwhile, Yeom Sung-gae was watching from outside, wondering how he'd handle the task of preventing other players from entering the building. It was definitely easier said than done, but he had to find some way to stop them so they could continue with the plan. He called Hugh Min-cha on the radio and asked if she had seen any unusual movement. She replied that she hadn't yet and asked if everything was going well with the detective. Yeom Sung-gae says that he had gone to confront the streamer and they needed to make sure no one else entered. Hugh Min-cha replies that she'll stay alert, and he asks if she had already used her ability that day. She says she hadn't felt the need to use it until then since she had been with Yeom Sung-gae all day. So he asks her to use her ability at that exact moment because he had a hypothesis. What if her power wasn't tied to the nearest target, but to the nearest person in motion? So if she had the ability active and another player approached, her vision's target would likely shift. Hugh Min-cha had never thought of using her power that way before. After all, in every moment she used it, there hadn't been more than one player in the area in a way that would allow the target to change within 5 minutes. If his hypothesis was correct, they could distinguish players from ordinary people approaching the building. Because the streamer's building wasn't purely residential, someone could try to sneak in disguised as a delivery person or even a resident. And if it worked, they'd be able to identify the opponent before being identified themselves, creating an opening for a surprise attack. She grabs the walkie-talkie and climbs down from the ledge, calling out to Sadius right after. It was time for them to take action. As soon as the power was activated, she could see Yeom Sung-gae's hand. But just as his hypothesis predicted, her vision quickly began to change. She alerts Yeom Sung-gae that the two people approaching the building at that moment were also players. He asks if both of them are or just one. But since her vision keeps shifting, then it's likely both are. Now Yeom Sung-gae had a problem. If it were just one person, he could find a way to handle it, but two people made things complicated, because there was no way to craft a strategy where both would commit the sin of betrayal. And even if he could handle one, there was always the possibility he couldn't handle the second. He needed to stay calm. They still didn't know he was a hell creator, so he still had the element of surprise up his sleeve. As soon as he appears, the two start debating whether or not he's a player, just as expected. They wanted to avoid involving ordinary people as much as possible. Meanwhile, Yeom Sung-gae wonders whether he should keep pretending to be a resident, because even if everything went wrong for the detective, he still had Hugh Min-cha. He recalls all the decisive moments in his life, and escaping had always been an act of complacency. But he was tired of running from things. The young man clenches his fist, lost in thought. He had obtained the key to hell precisely to punish people, and once again he was thinking of fleeing. Yeom Sung-gae remains still as the other two approach and ends up making a decision. He extends his hand and tells the two men that they shouldn't enter the building. Both look confused. While they had stopped, what should he do now? His strategy was to keep talking so the opponent wouldn't have time to think. It was like two strategists facing off. Yu Ning-han wonders if he was some ally of Vigaka he hadn't noticed before. but soon concludes that couldn't be the case. Since the streamer's hell was the hell of invasion, there was no reason for him to stop them there. So maybe he was from another group of opponents. However, that theory was also unclear. Assuming the guy was a player didn't quite match his actions. But if he wasn't a player, why was he stopping them from going in? Then he says they were conducting a building check due to a report they received about a woman screaming on the 7th floor. Yu Ning-han is outraged. He hadn't considered the possibility of a neighbor's report. The circumstances fit. Someone had probably reported it after hearing An high scream before being sent to hell. So local detectives had to secure the area. But that theory, if true, opened two distinct possibilities. Yu Ning-han stares at Yeon Sung-gi suspiciously. After all, the young man didn't look anything like a detective, too skinny, and that sweat dripping down his face was way too suspicious. However, before suspicions could turn into conclusions, Yeon Sung-gi decides to take a bold step. After all, a liar has to believe in their own lie. The businessman tries to speak with the detective's supposed assistant, but before he can continue, Yeon Sung-gi grabs a radio and reports the situation from downstairs. While he was talking to Gagaka, Park Sang-sik suddenly heard Yeon Sung-gi's voice over the radio, warning him that two residents were trying to enter. If the kid had contacted him first, it probably meant it was a risky situation. It was time for them to make their exit. He replied saying he was already heading down. It seemed the source of the report was actually just live streaming a horror game or something like that. The two were surprised to hear that what the kid had said was actually true. The protagonist really did know how to think quickly and strategically when needed. The checkmate had been delivered. If his opponent couldn't keep up with him, they wouldn't be able to follow. He informed them that the building would be cleared soon and asked the two to wait just a little longer. Park Sang-sik got out of the elevator, confirming that there had really been nothing wrong, and apologized for making the residents wait to enter. While putting away his police badge, he told them they could go in now. Yu Ning-han thought that, although he had been surprised, he still knew about Gagaka's hell, so he would move forward with his plan. He thanked the detective for his work, and commented that the neighborhood really had been a bit noisy lately. The two went to the elevator and entered the building. As soon as he exited, Park Sang-sik asked if those two were also creators and how they had figured it out. Yeon Sung-gi said it had been thanks to Hu Min-che's ability, and that those two were their enemies. He asked about the streamer, and the older man said that unfortunately he hadn't been able to send Gagaka to hell yet. However, thanks to the two young ones, they had managed to identify two more players. In total, 7 players had now been identified, one of them being the girl who had been absorbed by the YouTuber's hell. That had been a really good result for just one night of work. From now on, they could say the game had truly begun, and it was the first time so many players had come face to face. As planned, their group had managed to gather the information they wanted. Meanwhile, someone rang a doorbell. It was Yu Ning-han, and he had a proposal to make to the streamer. The businessman suggested that Gagaka become his dog, and in response the boy asked if he was insane. From outside, he said the person the other had killed was one of his dogs, and that as long as he didn't enter, the invasion hell couldn't be activated. His victorious smile was clear, while the young man inside hadn't expected that comment. If what that man had said was true, then what would he do if the streamer never left his house? The businessman answered that it was simple. He'd post someone to watch day and night, and the moment he stepped outside, he would personally show up. And let's say he didn't leave his house. How long could he last with the supplies he had? Even if he managed without ordering delivery, he'd last maybe 2 months, 4 at most. That brat had just signed his own prison sentence. Unexpectedly, instead of submitting, Gagaka rebelled and decided not to leave. The lunatic shivered with excitement. It would be a pleasure to torture him until he came out, and then he decided to leave. Gagaka discussed his new strategy with his demon. But unlike the boy, the demon was a little more pessimistic and asked if it was really worth buying time like that without solving the situation. But Gagaka answered saying that while time passed, someone else might end up sending that guy to hell. They just had to hold on a bit longer. But that method didn't last even a week. Every food delivery he ordered came with trash instead. And after reporting it to the police more than 3 times, they started thinking it was a prank. Soon after, someone cut the power, and the water in the apartments became contaminated. The anxiety of the enemy suddenly breaking in at any moment turned into insomnia. And when the freedom outside his apartment became more tempting than ever, a business card appeared under his door. "Get in touch if you've given up," it read, and with that, the streamer